Hello friends, welcome to my video. Today I'm going to talk about XML serialization, which is one of the serialization technology in C#. This is my second video of the series named 3 Main Serialization Technology in C#.NET. I named it as part 2 of the series. In this video, we'll see what XML serialization is, how and when to use it in a program. We'll also see its limitation. Finally, we will be comparing it with data contextualization. So before we get started, just a quick reminder to subscribe my channel, hit the red button and don't forget to click on the little bell icon. That way you will be notified every time I upload a new video. Okay, without any further delay, let's get started. Serialization and deserialization in C#. I have already discussed this earlier in part 1 of this series, but again I just repeat if you haven't seen part 1 yet. However, I would request you to watch part 1 of this series for understanding the data context serialization. Serialization is the process of converting an object into a stream of bytes to store the object or transmit it to a memory, a database, or a file. The reverse process is called deserialization. Okay, let's understand it with the help of diagram shown over here. So here there is an object that needs to be converted to a byte of streams. So how we can convert it? That's where serialization concept comes into the picture. So serialization helps us in converting an object into a stream of bytes that can be written into memory, database, or file. And its reverse process called as deserialization, where we take the data from a stream and convert it into an object. The main purpose of serialization deserialization is to save the state of an object in order to be able to recreate it when needed. So that's the basic funda of serialization and deserialization. XML serialization. What is XML serialization in C#? XML serialization in C# is the process of converting an object into an XML stream that can be stored on a file, database, memory, or can be transferred across the network. Please note that it serializes only the public fields and property values of an object. On the other hand, XML deserialization reconstructs the object from the XML stream. Whenever we are planning to use XML serialization in C#, we need to import this namespace, system.xml.serialization. XML serialization is an alternative to using other classes in .NET such as XmlReader and XmlWriter classes to parse and write an XML stream. Now we understood what is XML serialization, but how to use it? So for using XML serialization, we just need to follow 4 steps. Step 1, create a serializable instance. What does it mean is, we need to create an object that we are planning to serialize. It could be class object, dataset object, array object, and list object, etc. Step 2, create an instance of XML serializer while passing the type of an object to its constructor. So here in this step, we need to instantiate of the XML Serializer class for the type that we are planning to serialize, right? Step 3, initialize a storage medium to hold the serialized object. Basically, we create here a stream object that is home for keeping the serialized object, right? Step 4, call serialize method via XML Serializer instance of serialization and deserialize method via XML Serializer instance of deserialization. So here basically what we do, take the object of XML Serializer class from step 2, call its serialize method with 2 parameters. One, a stream object from step 3 and second, serializable instance from step 1. That's it. It will serialize the object, that is it will create a stream of bytes and write it in a storage file, say abc.xml. And for this deserialization, we just need to call deserialize method via object of XML Serializer and pass a stream object, and then cast it against the type in order to get the object back. That's it. We'll see some examples to understand it better. Simple example of XML serialization. Here we are going to see one simple example of XML serialization process in C#. As we need to implement XML serialization, we need to import system.xml.serialization. That's why I have imported over here using system.xml serialization. There is a namespace demo. Under that we have 2 classes, employee class and program class. Employee class has 2 auto-implemented public properties, ID and name. Program class has a main method that is an entry point of the application. As we discussed earlier, implementation of XML serialization is a 4-step process. So as a part of the step 1, we need to create a serializable instance. And that's why I have created an object of the employee class and assign the values of its properties id and name as 1 and Ravi respectively over here. So that's what I have written. Imply obj imp1 is equal to new imply, obj imp1.id is equal to 1, obj imp1.name is equal to Ravi. In step 2, we need to create an instance of the XML serializer while passing the type of the serializable object to its constructor. That's why I wrote where obj XML serializer is equal to new XML serializer type of imply, because this is the type we are going to serialize it. Next is the step 3, where we need to initialize a storage medium to hold the serialize object. So I created the stream object inside the using statement so that we do not need to close the stream object manually. It will be taken care by the compiler. That's why I wrote using stream as is equal to file.create imply.xml. And the fourth step, that is the last step, we need to call serialize method for serialization. So for this, I wrote obj xml serializer dot serialize s comma obj imp1. So here we passed two parameters to serialize method. One, a stream object s, and second, serialize object obj imp1, so that the serialize method would serialize the object in bytes and write it in the imply.xml file. Once program gets executed, the file imply.xml gets created, and when we open the file in the notepad, which is shown over here, we found imply element, this one imply xml and these are the element got created, and it has two sub element, id that has value 1 and name which has value Rabi. So it means that XML serialization happened successfully. And when we want to object back, we just deserialize this XML file and get it back. Let's see all these things in Visual Studio. So here we are on Visual Studio. Here we are going to see the examples of the XML serialization and deserialization in C#. So first we have to import this namespace system.xml.serialization. So there is a namespace demo where we have the class imply and the program. So imply class, we have two auto implemented public properties. So basically we are having the ID and name for that. So in program class, there is a main method which is an entry point of this application. Here I have just written this console.writeLine statement that I'm going to give the demo of the example 1 for the XML serialization deserialization in C#. As we know that for implementing XML serialization, we need to follow 4 steps. So step 1, we need to create a serializable instance. So for that, I have created an instance of this imply class and I have assigned the value to its properties. So obj imp1.id is equal to 1, obj imp1.name is equal to Ravi. I have assigned these values to these two properties. Then as a part of the second step, so before that I have just printed this statement. So before serialization, what this obj imp1 that contains the properties value. So I have just printed id is equal to obj imp1.id and obj imp1.name. That this statement is going to get printed before serialization. Okay. As a part of the step 2, we need to create an instance of the XML serializer while passing the type of an object to its constructor. That's what I have written this statement where obj XML serializer is equal to new XML serializer, and here I am just going to pass the type of the imply because we wanted to serialize an imply object. That's what I need to mention which type. So that's what I have written, type of is equal to imply, type of imply. Okay, in step 3, we need to initialize a storage medium to hold this serialize object. So for that, we have written this statement, a stream s is equal to file.create imply.xml. It will be creating a stream object that we are storing into this s variable. And I have written this statement inside this using statement so that we don't need to write manually a stream closing statement. Okay, once this initialization of a storage medium to hold this serialization object happens, we need to call this step 4 method. As a part of the step 4, we need to call the serialize method via XML serializer instance for serialization. That's what I have written, obj XML serializer.serialize, and I have passed two parameters. One is the stream object that we received from the step 3 and obj1 object that we have got from the step 1. So these two parameters I have passed so that this serialization process will happen and it will serialize obj imp1 object. Okay, so this serialization process completes. Now I just want to deserialize it to get the object back. Now we are going to see how the deserialization happens in C#. So for that, we need to just create the stream. First, how we are going to create it, because we have already written this imply.xml via the serialization process. So we, as a part of deserialization, we need to open this file and that's what I have written file.open file mode.open. So this file will get opened and it will be stored into this stream. Those things we need to deserialize it. So for that we are calling deserialize method and we are passing a stream as a parameter to it. And once this deserialization happens, we will be getting that object. So after getting an object, we need to cast it. So this is the implied type we are going to cast it, so that we will be getting the object of obj imp1, which is nothing but the implied type. So this variable will hold the object of implied type that we have recreated as a part of deserialization process. Once this variable holds this object, what we are doing, we are just printing into this console.writeLine statement. So console.writeLine after deserialization process recreated object properties values id. So that's what I have written obj imp1.id, and similarly for the name obj imp1.name, so that it will get printed into this console window. Let me execute this program and see the output. So here is the output. Example 1, XML serialization, deserialization in C# got printed because I have written this console.writeLine statement. Before serialization object properties values id is equal to 1, name is equal to Ravi. And after deserialization process recreated object properties value id is equal to 1, name is equal to Ravi. So it basically depicts that this relation happens and also deserialization happens, and it recreated the object properties same as before serialization. So this XML serialization and deserialization process works seamlessly. So here we are going to see example number 2 for XML serialization with its attribute. In order to show the demo, I have created class named imply that has 4 auto-implemented properties: ID, name, DOB, and marital status. If you notice, I have annotated this class imply with attribute and pass this imply detail to it. So what it will do, it will create a new XmlRoot element with name imply detail. And if you notice, for ID property, I have annotated with the XmlAttribute and pass the value imply ID to it. So it will do whenever that XML serialization process happens, it will consider this property as an attribute and it will be a part of the implied detail XML element. Next, I mark name property to XML element and gave imply name to it. Similarly, I did for the DOB, but for marital status, I annotated with the XmlIgnore attribute. So it will not be considered as a part of the XML serialization process. Okay, now if you see this class program where we have this main method, which is nothing but an entry point of this application. Okay, so here I have just printed this console.writeLine statement example 2 XML serialization with its attributes, because I'm giving the demo of the attributes, XML serialization attributes, right? So as a part of step 1, I'm just going to create a serializable instance. So for that, I have written imply obj imply is equal to new imply, so that we will be getting an object of this implied type, right? And I have assigned the value for all the properties. So that's what I have written: obj imply.id is equal to 1, obj imply.name is equal to James, obj imply.dob is equal to 25th Jan 1991, obj imply.marital status is equal to married, right? Once we have populated these properties values to this object, I am just printing it into this console window. So that's what I have written: console.writeLine before serialization object properties values obj imply.id, name obj imply.name, dob obj imply.dob, marital status obj imply.marital status. So for all these 4 attributes will get printed in this console.writeLine statement before serialization process. Okay, now we have completed this step 1. In step 2, we need to create an instance of the XML serializer while passing the type of an object to its constructor. And that's what I wrote: where obj XML serializer is equal to new XML serializer type of imply, right? In step 3, we need to initialize a storage medium to hold the serialized object. So for that, I have written text writer is equal to new stream writer, and here I have given imply.xml. And as a part of the step 4, we need to call the serialize method via XML serializer's instance for serialization. And that's what I have written: obj XML serializer.serialize. And here we pass 2 parameters. One, text writer, which we have received from the as a part of a step 3, right? And obj imply, which we have received from the part of step 1. So these 2 parameters we are passing so that this obj imply object gets serialized seamlessly. Okay, so now serialization process happens and we are able to serialize those things. Now what I'm doing, whatever the serialization happened after that, I am just marking this obj imply is equal to null. And we are going to see for the deserialization. So here what we have written, where stream is equal to file.open imply.xml file mode.open. Now we are going to call this deserialize method of obj xml serializer object, right? And we are passing a stream object to it. So what it will do, it will deserialize this xml stream and convert it into the object. And once we get the object, we are casting to the imply type, so that we are able to store into this obj imply variable, which is nothing but the imply type, right? Once this object gets created, we are accessing those values and printing into this console window. And that's what I have written, console.writeline after deserialization process recreated object properties values. And here what we are doing, obj imply.id, obj imply.name, obj imply.dob, and obj imply.marital status. But if you notice, we have already marked this marital status is the XmlIgnore. So what will happen if we are going to retrieve after deserialization, this value should return as a null value. So it will be null, right? So ideally it should not get printed into anything into this console.writeline statement. Okay, let me execute this and see the output. Now if you see, the output got appear into this console window. Example number 2, XML serialization with its attribute. Before serialization object properties values, it got printed ID, name, DOB, marital status. If you notice, marital status married got printed because before serialization object is having all the properties. But we have already seen that we have marked marital status with the XmlIgnore attribute. So as a part of serialization process, this attribute will not participate into this serialization process. That's what. After deserialization process, this recreated object properties value that we are printing over here, ID is equal to 1, name is equal to James, DOB is equal to this one, marital status is coming blank over here because marital status did not participate in the serialization process. And that's what, when we are doing the deserialization, we are going to get nothing. Right now, let me open that XML file that was created as a part of the serialization process so that we can witness how that structure looks like. The XML got created, right? So I have opened this imply.xml file in Internet Explorer, and if you see, it got created this XML file correctly, right? If you see the parent element, that is the root element, imply detail got printed, and we have marked this imply ID with the XML attribute, and I have given that name as imply ID, right? So that's what it is coming as a part of this attribute of this imply detail element, right? So imply detail, imply ID is equal to 1, and this is the name space got printed, and then it has two elements, right? Imply name and date of birth. If you notice, marital status is not. Marital status has XmlIgnore attribute, so that it did not participate in serialization process, and that's why this element is not appearing into this XML file. So that's why. So with the help of XML serialization and its attributes, we are able to control how the XML file would get generated. So here we are going to see the example number 3, XML serialization for a nested class object. So for that, I have two classes, imply class and address class. And imply class contains this address class, and I have just given the name as a permanent address over here. So imply class has other attributes like ID, name, DOB, marital status, and permanent address. And we have marked couple of the attributes to each and every auto-implemented properties. For example, ID, we have marked XmlAttribute imply ID, name with the XmlElement imply name, DOB, date of birth, XmlElement, and marital status I just put as a XmlIgnore. But this public address, permanent address, we did not mark anything, so it will be taking as a part because this is the public auto implemented properties, right? Okay, now we did not mark XmlElement because we don't want to change this permanent address. I just want to keep as it is, right? So that's what I have did not annotate with any attributes over there because we don't need any modification in this particular properties. Okay, so now if you see this address class, it has 3 auto implemented properties: address line 1, address line 2, and city, right? So all these things will get participate into this serialization process. So basically what we are doing, we are just going to serialize for the nested class because imply is having another class inside that, right? So for that, we don't need to do anything. We just need to add this class inside that, and it should be public so that it will take participate into this serialization process. Okay, now what I have done, I have just written this program class. Inside that there is a main method which is an entry point of this application where we have this console.writeline statement. I just wrote because I just giving the demo of the XML serialization for a nested classes object. Okay, Now, as a part of the step 1, I need to create this employee object, right? So for that, I have written employee obj employee is equal to new employee, and then I have given the value for the ID, name, DOB, marital status, and for permanent addresses, I have assigned to the new address to it. So what I have done, I have created new instance of this address class and added these values to it: address line 1, address line 2, and city to it, right? We have created this serializable instance, right? Now in step 2, we need to create an instance of the XML serializer while passing the type of an object to its constructor. So I have just written this statement where obj XML serializer is equal to new XML serializer type of employee, and this employee is nothing but the nested class, right? We do have another class inside that is nothing but the address that we wanted to serialize into the XML. So that's what I have just initialized and given the type to it. Now, as a part of the step 3, we need to initialize a storage medium to hold the serialized object. And for that, I have written this using a statement. Inside that, I have written text writer is equal to new string writer imply.xml. And then as a part of the step 4, we need to call serialize method via XML serializer instance for serialization, right? For that, I have just written obj XML serializer.serialize, and I have passed text writer and obj imply, so that obj imply will get serialized to the XML. Now let me execute this and see how that output gets created into this XML file. Okay, so just now you have seen that a statement got printed, this one, example 3 XML serialization for a nested class, and this console window got closed, right? And if you see what is the output, I mean the XML file got generated. Let me open this and let me show to you. Okay, now if you see that I have just opened this employee.xml file in Internet Explorer. So if you see the parent element, that is the root element, got created employee detail, and it has employee ID as an attribute, and the other two elements, right, employee name and date of birth got printed. Marital state did not get printed because that was marked with the XmlIgnore attribute, right? And we have this permanent address, which is nothing but the nested class, right? Another class inside this employee, and that's what it got printed, permanent address. And inside that, these three attributes got printed: address line 1, address line 2, and city. And then permanent address get closed, and then finally the employee detail get closed. So here we are on Visual Studio. Here we are going to see the example number 4, XML serialization for a dataset object. So there is a class program under this namespace demo. We do have main method, right? In main method, we have written this console.writeLine statement, example 4, XML serialization for a dataset object, because I'm just giving the example of this dataset object, how we are going to serialize into this as a part of the XML serialization, right? Okay, now for that we need to create a dataset object. So for that, I have just written dataset ds is equal to new dataset, and I have given this dataset name as a employee dataset, right? Inside that, we need to add this data table. So for that, I have created an instance of data table. That's what I have written, data table dt is equal to new data table, and I have given this data table name as a employee data table, right? Inside that, we need to add the column. So for that only, I have just created an instance of this data column, and I have mentioned ID and what is the type for that particular ID, right? So I have written type of int, and this data column we are storing into the dc1 variable. Similarly, I have created another data column dc2, and I have given name to it with the name, and which type of that is the type of a string. So we have just mentioned to it. Now in this data table, I'm just going to add dc1 and dc2 column. So for that, I have written dt.columns.add dc1, dt.columns.add dc2, and finally I have data table ready where we have data columns, right? Now what I need to do, I need to add this data table to the data set. So for that, I need to write ds.tables.add, and we just need to pass dt to it, so that this data set will have data table in it, right? Now everything is ready, data set is ready. Now what I need to do, I need to add this data table with rows. So for that, we need to adding row in a table level. So for that, I need to create an instance of the data row, and that's what I have written, data row is equal to dt.new row. So new row will get created and stored into this row variable, and then once the data row get created, I am just putting some values to these two columns under that particular row. So that's what I have written, row 0 is equal to 1, row 1 is equal to James, and once this row is having that value, then we are adding into the data table. So that's what I have written, dt.rows.add and row. Similarly, for the second row, I have given that row 0 is equal to 2, row 1 is equal to Raj, and then I am adding this particular row also into this data table. So data table is ready, and data table is inside that data set. Now data set is ready with all the data that we wanted to serialize it. So part 1 is completed. Now we need to create an instance of the XML serializer while passing the type of an object to its constructor. So for that, we need to write where obj XML Serializer is equal to new XML Serializer type of dataset, because we are going to XML serialize of this dataset, right? That's what I need to pass this type. So that's what I have written these things. Okay. As a part of the step 3, we need to initialize a storage medium to hold this serialized object. So for that, I have written under this using statement text writer is equal to new stream writer imply.xml. And then as a part of step 4, we need to call serialize method via XML Serializer instance for serialization. And that's what I have written, obj XML Serializer.serialize text writer, and then we are passing this DS. DS is nothing but data set that we are going to serialize it, right? And that's it. Now let me execute this and see how that XML gets created as a part of this XML serialization process for dataset. Okay, let me execute this by clicking this. Just now you have seen that this statement got printed into this console window, and console window got closed. Let me open this XML file and see how it looks like. Okay, I have opened this imply.xml into this Internet Explorer. This XML got created, right? So basically it serialized that data set into the XML via this XML serialization process. So this is what it looks like. Limitations of XML serialization in C#. So here we are going to discuss about the limitation of the XML serialization in C#. What are those limitations? Number 1, XML serialization does not include any type information. So let's suppose if you want to know what is the type information for the particular object that we are trying to serialize, so those things it is not get captured as a part of the XML serialization process. That's what I have written, XML serialization does not include any type information. Number 2, XML serialization does not convert methods, indexes, private fields, or read-only properties except read-only collection. So here read-only collection is allowed as a part of the XML serialization, but conversion of object, indexer, private fields, or read-only properties are not allowed. So it is not going to get participated into this XML serialization process. Number 3, XML serializer serialized only the following items. What are those items? Public read write properties and fields of the public classes, XmlElement objects, XmlNode objects, dataset objects, classes that implement iCollection or iEnumerable, but only collection are serialized, not the public properties. So we need to keep in mind whenever we are going ahead with the XML serializers, so only these items are going to get serialized. So if that is the requirement, we can go ahead for the XML serialization. Otherwise, we could opt some other serialization technique. Okay, why use XML serialization? It's very useful when there is a need to send data over the network or stored in a files, and that file could be the XML file, because XML serialization is going to convert streams into the XML stream, right? It will be written into the files or maybe memory or maybe in database. Wherever we wanted to write it, we could write it. Okay. Number 2, serialized data being XML rarely has any problems passing over networks and through security measures such as firewall. So XML is treated as a best transport format. Whenever we are going to pass through network or we can pass through the firewalls, so it's the best suited, right? Number 3, XML serialization is a platform independent. In other words, we do not have to have .NET or Windows on both ends of the process. Number 4, XML Serializer class gives us complete and flexible control when we serialize an object as XML. So basically XML gives us the control. Let's suppose if we want to write the properties as a part of the attribute of the XML, we could do so because we do have the control where to write those values. So that's what I have written. XML Serializer gives us the complete and flexible control when we serialize an object as an XML. So these are basically reason we go for the XML serialization. XML serialization versus data contract serialization. We just now learned about XML serialization in this video, and in part 1 of this serialization video series, we have learned about data contract serialization. So here we are going to compare XML serialization with data contract serialization. Number 1, XML Serializer serializes only public members, whereas Data Contract Serializer all members which are marked with data member attribute even if member is marked private. Number 2. XML Serializer cannot serialize types that implement iDictionary. Also, XML Serialize cannot translate the hash table into XML. On the other hand, Data Contract Serializer can serialize type that implement iDictionary. Number 3. XML Serializer has a lower performance compared to the Data Contract Serializer. Data Contract Serializer has a better performance compared to the XML Serializer because Data Contract Serializer explicitly shows which field or properties are serialized into XML. Number 4. For any type that needs to be serialized by XML Serializer must have a default constructor, whereas Data Contract Serializer does not need any default constructor before serializing any type. Number 5. Web services uses XML Serializer attribute, whereas WCF uses Data Contract Serializer attribute. Now that brings me to end of my session. To sum up, in this video we saw what XML serialization in C# is and how and when to use it in a program. Then we saw a couple of examples of the XML serialization, deserialization with class object, nested class objects, dataset object, etc. After that, we talked about the limitation of the XML serialization, and finally we compared XML serialization with the data contract serialization. That's all for this video, guys. If you like this video, hit the like button, share it with your friends and colleagues, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done already. Thanks for watching. See you next video.